Hi, everybody. Welcome to NWSOFA, which stands for Northwest Suburbs of Chicago. We're an indivisible chapter. And tonight we are going to have the fortune to listen to um, David Doney and Karl Faulstich, our co-chairs of our fiscal and economic group. Just a little bit about NWSOFA. As we said, we're a part of Indivisible, who has 6,500 chapters across the country. There has been a tremendous resurgence of people looking to join or start their own chapters. I was heard from Indivisible National that 100 new chapters have started since Trump was elected, which is great, and we really appreciate that. So NWSOFA got founded in 2012. 17 people were there for the first event where we were trying to figure out what we could do. We decided that we would work on issues. And the very first one was one that we did not determine ourselves. It happened right after the school shooting at Sandy Hook. So our very first issue, if you could see the turquoise snowflake there at the top, is gun violence prevention. And then shortly thereafter, we did a lot of work on healthcare reform and then immigration reform. And each time we added a new group, we added new leaders to keep those groups going. And then we added social justice in our Stand With Women group, which is one of our strongest these days. Then our fiscal and economics group. And then recently we've added our election outreach for both local, state, and national. We've had a consistent climate change group that has been warning us about global warming and the environment. It's actually now we're going to be calling it climate and environmental. And then we have two Restore Our Democracy groups. We call them ROD, but it's Restore Our Democracy. One group works on voting rights, elections, gerrymandering, vote by mail. The other group works on confronting disinformation and, in general, the hot topics of the day. So we have 10 different groups that make up NWSOFA issue teams. And then on the left side, in the orange, you see our communications team. And if you're getting a lot of different notices and things about meetings, you're getting them from this group of folks. Part of the secret sauce of our group is we got 24 all volunteer leaders. Some of the leaders work on both sides as a co-lead of an issue team and also on the communication side. But this is a group of people that brings everything together, which we really, really appreciate. A couple things that we do that are interesting these days. Every morning at 9 a.m., we have a coffee and conversation. That's Monday through Friday. And it's a conversation. People just join. Typically, we have 24, 25 to 40. I think we've had as high as 70 right after the elections. And then very similar at 5 o'clock on Friday, we have what was a happy hour, what's now an unhappy happy hour. And we get usually well over 100 people that join that conversation. We have people just talking about what they're concerned about. Very fast paced, makes your head spin a few times, but it is really great. And we have people joining both the coffee and conversation and the unhappy happy hour from across the country and a few other countries. So that's neat. Now, tonight, as I said, we've got Karl Faulstich and Dave Doney. They have been our co-leads of the Fiscal and Economics group. This group was established about 11 years ago, and they have been consistent on their presentations. Those of you who have been on these calls before will notice the cadence and how it flows. Those of you who have not, just say that we encourage people when you don't understand what they're talking about to raise your digital hand and ask a question. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave and Karl. Go ahead, guys.
All right. Karl, are you going to start us off or do you want me to?
Why don't you start?
Sure. All right. Well, welcome tonight. Appreciate you guys all coming. We do a thorough briefing on what's going on in the economy and to a lesser extent, the fiscal situation of the federal budget. We help you understand what the facts are so you can sharpen your arguments and communicate to your audience. We use the best sources we can find, which is usually the Congressional Budget Office, the Federal Reserve. We use the FRED database, meaning the Federal Reserve Economic Database. So if you see a slide that has a blue border that says FRED, it isn't our buddy Fred that does that for us. It's the Federal Reserve Economic Data. So you're going to get the best sources, and each page will have citations generally at the bottom in terms of where that comes from. Tonight, we're going to cover the labor market, the deficits and debt, sort of a bunch of statistics on household financial position, which gets us into wages and inflation. We're going to go through the CBO's latest report on income inequality. They do it every year, and it's got a ton of great information in there. The Congressional Budget Office, CBO, is the impartial, unbiased group that advises the Congress. And their reports are some of the best information you can get. And so when they issue a big report on a subject, they do the income inequality report every year. We update people here on it. And then a variety of miscellaneous measures that have been in the news. And then suggests a couple of courses of action that you can take. For example, we'll talk about how to contact the Democratic National Committee. If you are contacting your senator or a member of the House of Representatives on things related to, let's say, how the Democrats can do better, they will refer you elsewhere because they're not supposed to be involved in campaigning in their official sites. You got to go to their campaign sites to do that. So, Karl, do you want to take over here, or should I keep going?
Oh, I guess I can do it. In October, we had a very low month for job growth. It was reported initially at 12,000 jobs. And so in November, it bounced back 270-some-thousand jobs. Now, October was down for a couple of reasons. One, there were a couple of hurricanes, which caused people to not be working, and also a big Boeing strike. What we see here is that job growth was continuing coming out of the Great Recession. Job growth grew under Obama. It continued to grow under Trump. And then we hit the pandemic, and in February and March and April of 2020, we lost 22 million jobs, payroll jobs, and it's been recovering since then. We'd recovered all those 22 million payroll jobs by June of 2022, a couple of years later, and it's continued to grow since then. So we're about 7 million jobs over where we were pre-pandemic, which is pretty darn good. Even with that 12,000, which is now been revised up, pretty good job growth over 3-month average of 173,000. Over the last 3 months, it's come down a little bit. We'll see. Hopefully, we will continue to have good job growth going into next year. The December and January months will be Biden months, and then starting in February will be Trump months, and we'll see what happens with job growth there. This is monthly job creation on average, and we see that higher under Obama than under Trump. Trump, the first 3 years was not a bad job growth. Overall, 4 years, it was actually negative by over a couple of jobs. So that's not good. But then under Biden, we've had good job growth, even once we got back all of the jobs that were lost, the 22 million jobs that were lost, we still have had good job growth since then, higher than almost every president, I think, except Clinton might have averaged higher than that. And this is an interesting one. It's selective dates. If we go back to George H.W. Bush, we see that there have been 51 million jobs have been added since Bush took office in 1989, and of those, 50 million were added under Democratic presidents, partially because of the loss of jobs under Trump, but also because the jobs added under Republican presidents was not high. It was higher under the Democratic presidents. Now, if you go back one more Republican president, we get Reagan. Over 8 years, he averaged like 168,000 jobs a month, I think it was. So that was millions and millions of jobs added under Reagan. And going back one more president to Carter, he averaged 215,000 jobs added per month, but it was only for a 4-year term. So unemployment rate went up during the pandemic. If we extended the graph off to the left, we'd see that we started with a 4.7% unemployment rate when Trump took office, and when we left office, we had a 6.4% unemployment rate, which is consistent with Republican presidents except Reagan, who pretty much all had left office with a higher unemployment rate than when they took office. Okay, trying to pull up this presentation. Okay, but what we have here is that unemployment has gone up somewhat. We have the unemployment rate curved up.
I can help you while we wait.
Okay.
What's happened with the unemployment level? When Biden came into office, it was about 10.2 million people unemployed. Still in the middle of the pandemic, it did come down from its peak, but it was still very high. And it got all the way down to 5.7 million unemployed people in December of 22, which is the lowest that it hit during that time. And you can see that it stayed down in that range for a while. And then it's been creeping up since then, though. It's about 7.1 million unemployed people right now, about plus 1.4 million from the bottom. So when you hear about the Federal Reserve and many things are going well in the economy, as we'll cover today, most things are looking very good, but the number of unemployed, we're no longer at full employment anymore. There's some slack there. There's that 1.4 million from that historically really incredibly good level of 3.4% that Biden hit. We hit a low of 3.4% under Biden around that time, December, in that late 2022, early 2023 period. And so the Fed is looking at this saying, we may continue to lower interest rates, even though the stock market's booming and other things are going really well. We're not at full employment anymore. And as you know, many of you know, the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate. One is to keep prices under control. The other one is full employment. And so they know that inflation has been coming down and is pretty flat, not quite to their target yet, but the number of unemployed is definitely higher than it needs to be. So this is why they're looking at that. And when you hear different arguments about whether the Fed's going to lower the interest rates or not, this is one argument for continuing to lower the rates. Is these 1.25 million or 1.4 million people that are unemployed off our best? Let me know when you're ready, Karl, or I'll keep talking. Another way to look at it is how long have people been unemployed? And the median means half above and half below. It's not quite the same as the average, although that's similar. Median allows you to take out some of the outliers that might distort things, that it can distort an average. So a lot of the Biden administration you see down in this part was more like 7 or 8 weeks, and now we're closer to 10. Ernie Tedeschi was an economist that worked in the Biden administration. I like following him on Twitter. He's very informative. And so he pointed this out, saying, we have some slack forming in the labor market. Everything isn't perfect, but it's still very good. I mean, the unemployment rate, 4.2%, is very low historically. The historical average is 5.8%, for example, but it's not full employment. And so you're seeing some other signs here of some slack, some slowing in that labor market. This shows the survey. There are a couple of surveys. When we talk about jobs, that's called the establishment survey. They ask employers who's on their payroll. And that's why the jobs report is so important. That's considered the best data that's available. The data that they get for the unemployment rate and the statistics that are here is called the household survey. They interview about 60,000 households every month for this. You can imagine the call center operation they must be running to call 60,000 households. But that's what they do to get the unemployment rate. What's been happening here is this is also showing some slack, meaning most of these measures are worse than they were last month. And this is the second month in a row with a lot of red on there. So these numbers are all in thousands. So for example, in the non-institutional population, this is not military, not in jail, age 16 and up. You've got 269,000 people in that bucket. And for scale, the US has about 330 million people total. And that number, the population got bigger as you would expect. But the labor force, which is the sum of the employed and the unemployed, fell. Some of the rates that are calculated, the participation, the employment to population, those ratios all got a little worse. The number of employed fell, the number of unemployed increased. often people will look at this because this is not the same as jobs. Those numbers over time tend to even out, but this survey tends to be more volatile. So the jobs report, that first slide we shared with you that showed about 200,000 plus jobs being added, is the more credible survey. But this one also tells you you've got some issues going on with the rising unemployment. Not all is well in the labor market, although everything is still good. It's just going in the wrong direction a little bit these days. The employment to population ratio for the 25 to 54 is another great way of seeing how things are going. This is how many people are employed to the number of people in the population, and it's just for that age range. So it throws out the fact that this is an aging country. It's much better to use these 25 to 54 statistics for participation than to use the overall number. And so what's happened here is right before the pandemic, we were at 80.5, and we were above that for much of the Biden past couple of years. But just now, we just fell below that in November, 80.4, still better than 2019 on average, but below where we were just before the pandemic. And you have to go back when we hit the 80.9 peaks. So these peaks in here and here, you have to go all the way back to 2001 to do better. So, I mean, these were very good numbers, and that's starting to come off of that total. So you can think of this as an economy that it's almost like, to use a mountain analogy, we went to the mountain peak. It's about as good an economy as you can get. And we're kind of coming over the peak now. And we're starting to come down that hill a little bit. And that's what you're starting to see in the labor market. How you doing, Karl?
Oh, I can jump in here. So on the slide 13, ratio of job openings to unemployed. And basically this is a positive note, but not quite as positive as it was 6 months ago. Basically, there's a couple more job openings than there are unemployed, but that's not a 100% match between the people who are unemployed and the job openings, both in terms of skills as well as geography. We find that some states have unemployment rates down in the 2% range, and others have unemployment rates up in the 5, 6, 7% range. Still, overall, more job openings than there are unemployed, so that's a positive. Moving on, conservative friends talk about how all the jobs that were added under Biden were part-time and government and multiple job holders and all kinds of other things, reasons why they aren't real. And that's not quite true. The share of part-time government and multiple job holders are about the same or better than pre-pandemic. Layoffs are near historical lows. And so you can see that things are a little better than they were back in Trump's greatest economy ever in 2019 on these metrics. I will add one thing on the fiscal side. As most of us know, the government runs out of money at midnight on Friday if we don't pass a continuing resolution. But it looks like we're going to get a continuing resolution that's relatively clean and will get passed this week before the deadline. It's going to repair the bridge that the ship hit in Maryland and transfer ownership of the land where RFK Stadium is to the Washington, D.C., so they can build a new football stadium. Are the only things that are not entirely clean, but we'll see what ends up in the final bill on Friday. Questions on the labor market, folks? Were there any in the chat? Were there any comments in the chat? I'm not sure.
Karl, I see one from Jay Gregory. It says, why do we seem to get credit for this consistent performance in talking about jobs and unemployment, lower unemployment?
Well, one of the things that I've commented on in prior meetings is that to a certain extent, our own worst enemies, the economy is not perfect. There are people who are, don't have jobs. There are people who don't have jobs that pay a lot of money. There's people in poverty. A lot of our progressive friends highlight those aspects heading into elections. So after 4 years of Biden or after 4 or 8 years of Obama, our progressive friends were talking about everything that was wrong with the economy. And that's one reason we don't get the credit, is we don't give ourselves the credit.
I'm looking through some of the chat questions as well. I mean, the slide that I'm showing now, I think answers the first question around showing what percent of the job additions were private sector. We're pointing out here that the government, the share of jobs that are government is lower, meaning the share of private sector is actually higher in 2023 and 2024 than in 2019, meaning you've got a very robust private sector job creation going on. I mean, 2019 was an excellent, excellent economy. Trump was not crazy to say it was the greatest economy ever. We're going to show you a lot of evidence that 2022 to 2024 was actually better than 2019 on most measures. And that's not something you hear in the media. And some of that we'll talk about a lot, I suspect, today, is that we need to do a better job of marketing. A lot of people don't know. There seems to be a hesitancy with Democrats to brag about the economy because some people that are left behind will get very upset about that. But you want to make sure the 90% know how good the economy is. Otherwise, they'll just default to a Republican narrative, which is the economy stinks. The media sort of created a triple crisis that none of those three elements really were real. They said we had an inflation crisis, a housing crisis, and an immigration crisis. And we'll show you that wages and net worth far outgrew inflation, and that we had more purchasing power in 2023 than we did in 2019. More purchasing power because incomes outgrew inflation across the income distribution, everybody, the bottom 20% all the way up. I'll show you the slides on that in a minute. So I'm saying that there really wasn't an inflation crisis. It would have been an inflation crisis if prices went up, but wages did not. But what happened is purchasing power actually increased. And so the media didn't tell you that, though. They just would say, you've got an inflation crisis and the price of eggs, yada, yada. In terms of immigration, the idea that the country's being overrun by immigrants and there's this giant crime wave and all these murders happening, and none of that was really true. I mean, there were a couple of murders, but in general, immigrants don't commit crime as much as the native born. And then also, we needed those immigrants. We had 10 million job openings at one point, and immigrants helped fill them. The surge in immigration that we had was almost perfectly timed by Biden. If you want to blame Biden, it was perfectly timed. And it helped this recovery, which we'll show you is better than the rest of the world. And then also, that's immigration. And we also have about 4.4 million boomers turning 65 and retiring every year. And so you need immigrants to offset that. And we would be losing income and our economy would actually be shrinking without them. But what happened? The debate became all about border security and Democrats looking weak because we didn't secure the border, when we should have argued, we brought in the immigrants because we needed them. Say thank you because you're a lot richer because of these immigrants. I'll show you the congressional budget slide in a little bit that shows that immigrants are worth about $65,000 per household over the next decade. The immigration surge is going to make American incomes much higher because immigrant spending is our income, and vice versa. All those immigrants that come here, they need stuff, and the rest of us make it for them, and they pay us for it. That's how economies work. And so that's number two. And then housing, housing prices going up is a win if you're one of the 65% of households that own homes. And if your wages went up a lot, and you had a mortgage that was set before the pandemic, which most mortgages are 30-year and were set before the pandemic, you're paying off that fixed payment with a much higher wage. So it's definitely not a crisis for the 65% of homeowners. For renters, yes, it can be difficult for that group, but home ownership was actually higher in 2023 than 2019. Inflation crisis, arguable. Immigration crisis, very arguable. Housing crisis, arguable. But the media would not let you think that. And so the average voter is like, things are crumbling. I need a strong man to rescue me and put things back under control. And that was where we lost the control of the narrative. We should have never surrendered on those three narratives. We should have never let the media and Republicans drive that there was a triple crisis happening, when in fact, we were doing better on all those areas than we were. I'm just looking through some other items on here. We'll come back to this point about how do we sell the Democratic record of achievement. We absolutely have to, because otherwise the media will default to what Republicans are saying. And one of the things we talked about in the last meeting was the idea that Democrats need a strategy, meaning we need a mission statement that says, here's what we stand for, so that everybody knows what we stand for. And so it's out there all the time in the media, and people communicate consistently with that. And if somebody is saying something that's not consistent with the mission, Democratic leadership can just say, well, that's not consistent with the mission. Here's our mission. That's strategy. And we don't have that right now. Yeah, and there are a couple of questions. The presentation's available to everyone. If Bill doesn't have your email, please give it to him, and he can make sure you get it, and the rest of us can too. But you should all have a link to the presentation. His name is Ernie Tedeschi. Let me go back there real quick, and then we'll go to our next section. Ernie Tedeschi, he worked for the White House. I forget if it was the National Economic Council or the Council of Economic Advisors or both, but he's really, really good, and very good at explaining stuff in English. He does a lot of nice charts on Twitter and shares good information. I'll get off my soapbox and let's go into the deficit section here.
Okay, what do we got? We've got what happened, past tense. Again, fiscal years are October 1st to September 30th. So fiscal year 2024 is in the past. We're currently in fiscal year 2025. And we're working on the continuing resolution to fund fiscal year 2025, which will run through September 30th of 2025. But that will be Biden's last budget year. So what we see here is that taxes and tax revenues went up between fiscal year 2023 and fiscal year 2024. Expenditures went up likewise. And so the deficit was $1 trillion, which isn't good. You guys may recall that both presidential candidates seem to be competing to see who can propose the biggest deficit busters in their planned policies. And General Trump won that competition, but Kamala Harris was trying awful hard too. But anyhow, we've got a bit of a budget deficit increase, and then I don't know, I haven't seen anything for fiscal year 2025. Typically, the CBO will come out with what they think fiscal year 2025 will look like. Shocking everybody, the red bars, the Republican bars, tend to be bigger than the Democratic bars. When Trump took office in 2017, the projections were that budget deficits were going to go down for a few years, but with his tax cuts and his spending increases, we had budget deficits going up, and we were just shy of $1 trillion in fiscal year 2019. We were going to be over $1 trillion in fiscal year 2020 before the pandemic hit. And once the pandemic hit, we went over $3 trillion for the budget deficit, which is actually a good thing because people didn't starve. People didn't lose their houses, by and large. And they got a lot of support from the government. It may also be why people remember fondly fiscal year 2020 when they were living off the government dole. And so that was a Trump, and that was under Trump. And so that was a good thing that their personal finances were in good shape. They ignore the fact that it was because they were getting government money, whether it was the unemployment checks plus $600 a week, PPP loans to continue to allow people, as well as expanded benefits for Medicaid that were part of the CARES Act, child care credits and things like that were part of the CARES Act, so that all those things that made people comfortable were expensive, as we see with the couple of years of almost $3 trillion deficit. And then our Biden deficits fell, but they've been going up again under Biden. One of his favorites is he wants to forgive all the student loans, but that may not have been a good political move, that seemed to be sending money to those darn elite college graduates as opposed to the working men and women. Okay, any other comments on the historic budget deficits? So now we can look at the CBO's deficit forecast, and this is if there are no changes to policy. So if the Trump 2017 tax cuts expire and various other things happen, what we see is that the budget deficit will go down a little bit, but then the budget deficits will start to climb again with the aging of the population, as there's more people collecting Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. We don't often think of Medicaid as senior citizen, but the big growing chunk of Medicaid is actually nursing homes for senior citizens, because once people run out of money, Medicaid will pay for senior citizens in nursing homes. You just have to spend all your money first.
And let me just clarify something there, Karl. This is assuming that the Trump tax cuts expire, meaning that the deficits are going to be falling, as Karl mentioned here. But if Trump extends those, you're not going to see that dip in the blue line. And in fact, you should see, somewhere between, let's say, 250 to 350 billion more in deficits than you would see otherwise. It's a couple trillion plus over a decade that would be added if they extended. And actually, it's more than that. It's more like 4 trillion. I'm not sure how they get 4 trillion out of that, because it's the corporate cuts are already permanent, but the individual cuts are supposed to go away and revert back to the Obama tax levels. Trump's going to make sure that, or is going to try to make sure that doesn't happen. And Democrats can try to make sure that the taxes only go up for people making over 400,000, but it's not clear to me that they'll have that kind of power. Trump will probably get what he wants.
Good point. So here you say that lowering interest rates is a key to deficit reduction. It'll be interesting to see what happens with lowering interest rates, because part of that is deficit reduction on the primary deficit will tend to help put less pressure on borrowing costs, tend to help lower interest rates, where if the primary deficit increases, then interest rates will tend to increase as well. Moving to the next slide, what we see is that do we have the money to pay off the debt? We have this scary $27.6 trillion national debt held by the public, while we also have $154 trillion in assets held by the public. So the assets far exceed the debt. We just have to figure out how we can tap those assets to pay down the debt, or at least keep it from increasing.
All right.
Karl, did I see, or David, did I see under the deficits or under the debt that 60% of the debt is just paying the interest? Or did I read that wrong?
No, you read that right. The primary deficit is everything but interest. That's the definition of that primary piece. And so it's everything but interest. These are manageable numbers. Like $1 trillion a year is not a crazy size deficit for an economy our size. It's like 3% of GDP. In fact, the incoming Treasury Secretary is talking about a 3-3-3 plan. 3% GDP growth, 3% trade deficit, and 3% budget deficit. I think the 3% is the trade deficit. Don't quote me on that one, but the other two are correct. And so that $1 trillion is about 3% of GDP. To get there, it's not going to be easy, especially if he's going to extend the Trump tax cuts. I wouldn't consider any claim the Republicans have made credible to reduce the deficit. The interest, though, you're right, it's 60% of the debt addition over the next dozen years. It's very difficult for the government to get its deficit amount under control if the interest rates are 4 or 5%. Now, a piece of good news here is that bear in mind that interest is being paid to investors. The government is printing money and giving it to investors. Now, those tend to be richer people, but they are, it's being injected into the economy, and those people can spend it. So it's a form of stimulus. So it's not the end of the world that we have a lot of deficits, but at some point, is there a risk out there that we could have some kind of a serious debt crisis? I mean, it could happen. I think it's highly unlikely. I don't lose a lot of sleep over deficits and debt anymore, but it is one of those things where if you want to reduce it, lowering interest rates is really key to that, because as those bonds mature, it takes time. It doesn't happen overnight, because the interest rates are not floating overnight rates, right? They're 1 year. They got some 3-month and 1 year bills, and then you got 5, 10, 30-year treasuries. I have to look at how that's distributed. But so even if you lowered interest rates to 0 tomorrow, you still are paying interest on bonds that are out there for as long as 30 years. But many of those bonds were set before the pandemic. So it's some of those 30-year bonds have 1 or 2% interest rates on them. So it's not, you will see as interest rates come down, you will see this number go down. It just doesn't go overnight. Just keep that in mind. And you can't just cut this off. You have to have a sustained 30-year period of low interest rates to truly eliminate all of that. But Trump is clearly a zero interest rate guy. He doesn't want interest rates in that 4 or 5% range. One of the interesting things that happened was that when he got elected, because of concerns about higher inflation under him, meaning the tariffs and the immigration restriction and the tax cuts, there was concern that inflation would be higher. And some of those improvements, some of the lowering of the mortgage rates and other things quickly reversed when he won the election. So one of the Heather, I'm going to forget her last name. Her first name is Heather at the Washington Post was saying how, keep your eyes on the bond market, because if those bond yields are going up, that's the market essentially saying, we think Trump's policies are going to be inflationary. And so the interest rate is rising. The Fed can't control the long-term rates. They control the short-term rates. And so it'll be neat to see how the bond market reacts to Trump, and in some ways may discipline him, because people will scream if their bond prices are falling because interest rates are rising. A lot of those rich investors that are seeing the price of those bonds they own falling are going to be complaining. Remember, asset prices and interest rates move in opposite directions.
Thank you.
Heather Long, maybe at the Post, is that
Heather
correct?
Long, thank you. That's her. Yeah, she did a piece on that included a discussion. She discussed with several top economists. I retweeted it the other day. It's a really good discussion. If you follow her on Twitter, she doesn't post all of that much, so you can find it. But she interviewed, I think it was Greg Ip at the Washington Post, or she was on a call with two other economists, Benjamin Applebaum from formerly with the New York Times. It was really interesting discussion, but the bond market disciplining Trump was an interesting idea I hadn't heard elsewhere yet. Other stuff in the chat, let's pause for a minute and look to catch up here a little bit. Also, how are we doing on time? I don't have a watch in front of me. Here we go. Yes, I do. So usually we take a break around 8 o'clock for a few minutes and then we come back. So